Hi everyone, welcome to the September 27th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at last week's racing from around the country. Most eyes were trained on Saturday on Parx racecourse, where they ran their feature race of the year, the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby and Grade 1 Cotillion. Those two stakes for the 3-year-olds produced some nice speed figures in each division. Craig and I will talk about those races in depth, along with a couple of the other undercard stakes on that Pennsylvania Derby card on Saturday, the Gallant Bob and the Parx Dirt Mile. Then we'll head on to Churchill Downs, where they had a nice card of racing on Saturday, some 3-year-old stakes action in the Dogwood, the Harrods Creek, and the Bourbon Trail, some nice runners from the Steve Asmussen barn that achieved some good speed figures there. Then we'll move on to some other racetracks, Aqueduct or Belmont at the Big A. They ran a couple stakes, one on Saturday, one on Sunday. We'll discuss both of those for the fillies and mares. Pimlico actually had some nice races this past weekend, some stakes on Saturday that we'll discuss, and then we'll finish things up with that Sunday night card at Remington Park, which did feature the Grade 3 Oklahoma Derby, which I know Craig always likes to discuss every year, but we'll get to that at the end of the podcast. Craig, the bulk of the 3-year-old action did take place at Parx this week, and boy, Taba really delivered a breakout performance in that Pennsylvania Derby.
He did. I mean, he kind of had his breakout in the Santa Anita Derby, but I'd say he's been a little disappointing since. Obviously, he didn't do a lot of running in the Kentucky Derby. Disappointed a little bit in the Haskell, but man, did he make a nice forward move in this race, winning by 3 lengths, I think it was, ran a 1:31 TimeformUS speed figure, and just jumped right in there as a horse who I assume is going to go to the Breeders' Cup Classic from here, and he certainly showed he fits with this effort.
Yeah, I think the big concern with Taba was the race that he had run in the Haskell. He had looked a little bit unprofessional. I don't know if he looked like he wasn't appreciating racing inside of horses, or if he just kind of came off the bridle early, maybe fresh off that Kentucky Derby performance. Maybe he needed the race coming off that bit of a layoff, but boy, he took a real step forward just from an overall, maturity sense here. He was much more in the bridle in the middle portions of the race. Mike Smith seemed to have no problem sticking him on the rail down the backstretch. He didn't seem to mind the kickback at all. And once he angled this horse out into the clear, he just really finished, ran away from the field. It looked briefly like Zandon was going to make that run up the inside, but Taba was pulling away from him at the end. Just a really impressive performance. 1:31 TimeformUS speed figure. Kind of puts him about on par from a speed figure standpoint with Epicenter, who did win the Travers so impressively over the same two horses, Zandon and CyberKnife, and it's going to be interesting to see those two face off in the Breeders' Cup Classic.
It sure is, and they fit pretty much with everybody except Flightline. So with his last number, he certainly, I think this was the fastest 3-year-old figure, and you would expect them to get a little quicker and quicker as we move on, as these horses should still be improving. So I don't want to make a big deal out of a 1:31 versus a 1:29 from Epicenter. They're basically the same figure, and he just looked like a different horse. As you pointed out, Mike Smith moved them to the rail, and my first thought was, what in the world's he doing putting them down there? And he broke really well, and it just didn't seem to bother him. He looked like a totally different racehorse this time, much more professional.
I would say the rail was definitely not a bad place to be, especially by this point in the day at Parx. We saw a couple of horses come up the inside here, Taba being one, Zandon the other, who's just stayed on the rail for basically the entirety of his trip under Joel Rosario. So I don't think that was a bad thing, but the horse definitely handled it better this time. Behind them, Simplification improved a little bit off his West Virginia Derby performance. He was, a bit of an overachiever here, 15-1 finishing 4th, but I didn't see too much else to discuss behind these horses, Craig. A lot of horses, though, did achieve career best numbers in this race. And when I see that, I sometimes wonder a little bit about, maybe the speed figure being a little high, especially considering that it is Parx. Sometimes you do see some outlier numbers at that track, but it really does stand up to scrutiny for the top three finishers.
It does. I do worry a little bit about the horses that are back. I think that's just a function. We've talked about it before, almost like harness racing, where horses are able to just get sucked along the better figures than they would otherwise run if they were in races by themselves or against a weaker competition. It's just one of the things we have to deal with as handicappers. I did want to mention Zandon a little bit. I wanted to say that he hung again, but I just don't know if I can bring myself to that conclusion. He did did range up inside like he was going to be a real threat, but I want to give more credit to Taba that he just was the better horse on this day and was pulling away.
Yeah, and CyberKnife, we should mention, did have some minor trouble at the start. Seemed to get bumped a little bit from both sides, breaking about a half step slowly. That's why he was so far back in the early stages. I doubt that was the plan, to have him back in 8th alongside Zandon in the early stages of the race. He ran okay for him, but just didn't get as nice of a trip as he was able to work out when he was second in the Travers in his prior start.
I did want to touch on, you mentioned the rail. I agree with you. I think the rail was probably the best place to be. It certainly wasn't a Parx that we see sometimes if you're a guy that plays during the week like I do on times where the rail, everybody avoids it. I think it was fine. I saw a lot of talk on social media about it was another speed bias track. Personally, I didn't see that at all. I thought it was a very fair track. Horses were winning from all over. Sure, speed horses won, but that's what tends to happen on dirt when you get really good horses that make the front end. Taba came from off the pace. Many others did. So I think the rail was fine. It was a good place to be because, as always, if the footing's good, you're saving ground over everybody else. But I thought they did a nice job with the racetrack.
No, I think that's a good point to make. I was not suggesting that there was a rail bias at Parx, but like you were saying, sometimes at Parx, you do perceive the rail as not being the place to be just in a general sense on most days, and the track seemed very fair on Saturday. So not that the rail was an advantage by any means, other than the fact that it is the shortest way around the racetrack. We did see some rail runners also do pretty well in the Grade 1 Cotillion, though horses that were not necessarily drawn inside, especially not Society, Craig, who you had a great opinion on here at 7-1, but she quickly got to the rail because she just outbroke this field by about a length, and Florent Giroux angled over and set her right to the inside.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that because I was watching Florent Giroux Sunday here at Remington Park, and he did not show any of that kind of aggression that he did on Society. So I don't know if he was riding to instructions, but he was hell-bent to get to the lead, and he did it. It's kind of funny watching the beginning of this race. You actually see Society's tail kind of do this flipping thing where I'm pretty sure she hit the face of a Dare Manor with her tail as she went by. I don't think it was anything worth looking at or anything like that, but it was just how intent that Florent Giroux was to get over. He did cut it kind of close, but once he got there, the race was over. I mean, she just steadily increased the lead throughout the race, was handridden to the wire, ran a 124 speed figure, which was even better than her race at Charlestown. Not final time-wise. That got a better final time rating than this one by a couple points. But it showed me, as I suspected going in, 2 turns are no problem whatsoever for her, as you'd expect from a daughter of Gunrunner.
Yeah, no, this was a great opinion by you, Craig. She had really taken a big step forward in that race at Charlestown in her prior start, and she validated that form here. I would say it helped that her main pace rival going in, Adair Manor, just threw in a total clunker. I mean, she never looked like she was traveling well. I don't know if something happened, what you were talking about moving into the turn for the first time. I was almost wondering if there was a slight clipping of heels there, but it didn't look like Adair Manor really stumbled at all. She was just off the bridle a long way out, never looked like she was traveling well. Kind of a tale of 2 different workout patterns coming in, as she was the one that looked like she was training out of her skin coming into this race. Taba training not so well, and they kind of reversed. Taba was the one who ran really well. Adair Manor did not run to those workouts. So once she dropped out of the race very early, it kind of just left Society with this long, lonely lead, and nobody else really got into this race at all. I mean, there were quite a few no-shows in here. Green Up did not back up that big performance from last time. Horses like Goddess of Fire, Shahama, Gerrymander, they had absolutely nothing to offer. Most of them were beaten by 15-plus lengths in here.
Yeah, I think the one opinion that actually even more important than Society, I was able to pick her to win, was we were right about Secret Oath. She tailed off a little finally. She had just been kind of running the same figures, and she was run down late for second even by Morning Matcha, a huge long shot, who ran fine, but she didn't run a great speed figure. So Secret Oath is a horse I think that you have to continue to go against until she gets some kind of break. I think she looks like one that needs a rest.
Yeah, cool to see a horse like Morning Matcha get that grade one placing here, that black type, because she has danced all the dances. This was the 16th start of her career, the 9th start of her season, and she did pick up the pieces to get up for second here. But like you were alluding to, that just really speaks to the fact that a lot of other horses did not show up in this race, Secret Oath included. She made that brief bid on the far turn, but quickly flattened out after that, and Society just much the best in here, proved that she could get the 2-turn distance. It's going to be interesting to see what happens if they decide to move on to a race like the Breeders' Cup Distaff with her, because she's definitely one that's moving forward at the right time, and sometimes these up-and-coming 3-year-olds that are doing well heading into a race like that can outrun their odds, and she feels like one that will be a big price moving on to the Breeders' Cup if they decide to go there.
She'd certainly be a pace factor, and you touched on the workouts a little bit. I just wanted to mention, and I'm a guy that believes in workouts for sure, but they are just something that are just part of the puzzle. I know a lot of people fell in love with the Dare Manor in this spot, but you got to keep in mind with her and Taba, they kind of work the way they always work. So these are horses I would kind of evaluate more off the past performances than workouts. Unless you see something different, maybe don't take those workouts with a grain of salt, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make for anybody who's assessing workouts. You'd want to compare them to the way the horse has worked in the past, not necessarily the other horses in the race, because each of these horses are individuals, and you want to see how they're doing relative to their prior form, just kind of like you do with their race records. Let's move on to another one of the graded stakes for the 3-year-olds on that Saturday card at Parx. This one was sprinting 6 furlongs, the grade 2 Gallant Bob for the 3-year-olds. This race didn't achieve the fastest speed figure, Craig, but it was certainly an interesting race to handicap, which we did on the TimeformUS Forecast last week, and I think we did a pretty good job of it. Scaramouche got the job done here at 9-1, holding off the late charge of a Revolution. These two finished about 2 lengths ahead of that overachiever Run-In Son of a Gun, who achieved another graded stakes placing, finishing 3rd.
He did, and he had a little bit of trouble. This wasn't a very fast race. Scaramouche only ran a 1:14, which is a 2-point improvement over what he ran in the prep for this race, which he also won, and he kind of got a similar trip as he did that day. I do think the fact that most of the horses in the top 3 or 4 or 5 were pretty wide most of the way around. In this race, even though we don't have the fractions in red, it just has that feel of a race that kind of fell apart. We did have some kind of a pace stool up front early with Little Vic and Speaking and even Lightning Larry, and they just seemed to set it up for all the come from behind horses. So I'd say this race was probably a little bit better than the speed figure, but I don't think these are horses that if they show up for a race like the Breeders' Cup Sprint are really going to be any factor whatsoever.
No, I'd agree with that. These are not Breeders' Cup Sprint type horses. I think the 14 post position for Scaramouche, or maybe it ended up being post 13 because there was one scratch in this race, it turned out to be somewhat of an advantage because John Velasquez was just able to sit out in the clear the entire way. Sure, he covered some more ground than a few others in here, but he never had to deal with any kickback, which I think was a bit of an issue for some horses at Parx on Saturday, and he was just able to get the jump on Other Revolution, who was kind of hampered a little bit by drawing the 2-hole because he did have to raise in some traffic early. Not that he had trouble by any means, but Flavien Prat had to kind of work out that inside-out trip for him. He did it pretty well, just basically ran out of ground at the end as Other Revolution as Scaramouche was able to hold on for the victory. We'll talk about one other stakes race from that Saturday card at Parx. It was the Parx Dirt Mile, run a little bit earlier in the day. This one featured a little bit of controversy, Craig, as there was a disqualification. Far Mo Power, who crossed the wire first, taken down, placed second behind Mind Control. There definitely was some bumping in the stretch. This is one of those I could have seen going either way. I kind of understand why they did make the change, though.
I'm with you. When I look at these things, I always like to lean on the side of leave it as is unless you're definitive. But I think the bumping late probably did cost Mind Control the race. I'd say there's a very high percentage, much greater than 50, that he wins with Farmo Power stays straight. So I had no real problem with the DQ. I wouldn't have been all up in arms had they left it as is either, because it was, one of those tough to call. And these are the ones where the stewards should earn their money because that's what they're there for. good race from the top two. Nobody else really showed up. They ran 116 TimeformUS speed figures. Mind Control was coming out of a very tough trip at Charlestown where he was third, but I don't think he ran all that well in this spot. It wasn't a strong field at all, and as I said, only one other horse showed up, so I'm not sure what they do with him. He'd be a cool horse to own, but these are the kind of races where he's going to excel.
Yeah, I would not say the Mind Control put forth one of his better efforts here, but I agree he probably deserved to get put up in this race. It wasn't just that bump at the very end. There was a hard bump at the top of the stretch when they were turning into the straightaway, and maybe each of those bumps in isolation doesn't add up to a disqualification, but I think the sum of the parts, when you put it all together, probably did cost Mind Control the victory in here. Not that you like seeing people who bet on a 12-1 shot get taken down. That's always pretty tough, but it felt like the stewards made the right call this one. Craig, you did mention, nobody else showed up in this race, and that was kind of a theme that I was noticing throughout the dirt races at Parx on Saturday, is that in some of them there were these big gaps between horses. I mean, I noticed it in this race, the Greenwood Cup, which we're not going to talk about, where basically just two horses ran the race and nobody else did any running at all. We saw even that in the Cotillion, a little bit of that in the Pennsylvania Derby. Parx can be a quirky track, and I feel like sometimes we see some horses really love it and some horses just not handle it at all.
Yeah, and that's what it seemed like. And those are actually the tougher days to make speed figures for, because you try to use all the horses that were competitive. But as you say, there were a lot of horses that weren't really competitive. So it did kind of limit the sample size over what I would normally get when I sit down to make the figures for the card.
Well, let's continue with the 3-year-old racing, but move on to a different venue. That's Churchill Downs. We'll talk about some of the stakes races they ran there on their Saturday card. This one featured the return of last year's 2-year-old filly champion Echo Zulu in the Grade 3 Dogwood Stakes. Going 7 furlongs, which is right in her wheelhouse, Craig. I think they picked a good spot to bring her back off the layoff. This was her first start since being scratched at the gate from the Acorn. Prior to that, she had last raced in the Kentucky Oaks when she really didn't run that badly to be fourth. But this was a good spot to bring her back and get a confidence builder in her.
Yeah, this was a perfect spot. As you say, I thought Echo Zulu ran fine in the Kentucky Oaks. She actually got the second best speed figure that day, just a point behind Secret Oath, and she looked great in this spot. I wonder what they're going to do with her. You wonder about the distance for her. It seems like the distaff would be totally out at this point, for at least in my opinion. It just seems much too late. So why not give her a shot in a race like the Filly and Mare Sprint, which might be more in her wheelhouse anyway. It seems like one turn is perfect for her. And I saw nothing on Saturday night that would make me think she wouldn't be competitive in a race like that.
Yeah, I mean, we're still a little ways out from the Breeders' Cup, I think 5 or 6 weeks at this point, but the Filly and Mare Sprint does feel like one of those races that's totally wide open at this point. I mean, I guess Goodnight Olive off her Ballerina victory with a pretty nice speed figure is in the conversation to be favored in that race, and we'll talk about another filly that's, a little bit older that might attract some support as well, but there are some 3-year-olds that have been running some nice speed figures that I think deserve to take a shot in that race, Echo Zulu being one of them. She got a 117 here, pulling away to win this race by over 5 lengths. Actually, the exact same exacta that we saw going this distance in the spin-away when both she and Tarabi were 2-year-olds, as they were also 1-2 in that spot. Nice to see Tarabi get back to the races after missing a little bit of time at the Saratoga meet following her opening day victory there. But Echo Zulu, I agree, Craig. If she can take a step forward off this return race, she belongs in a race like the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint. Let's move on to another stakes for the 3-year-olds going 7 furlongs. This one for the males, and another Steve Asmussen trainee here as Gallant Knight gets the victory in the Harrods Creek over his rival Conager. Both of these were coming out of performances in the H. Allen Jerkins Memorial at Saratoga on Travers Day. And Craig, I think both Gallant Knight and Conager validated the speed figure that Jack Christopher got that day, as they came back with some nice performances here to be 1-2 again.
Yeah, they're pretty good sprinters for sure. I liked what I saw from Gallant Knight, and I like what I saw from Conager, but I think it's pretty clear that Gallant Knight is a better horse at this point. He had run a 125 last time out. He ran a 123 for this race. So he's good. He doesn't need to lead. He can track other horses, and he's just he's one I would assume they're going to give a shot to, and why not? He looks like a good one. I don't know that He could handle Jack Christopher if everything went that one's way, but you don't want to duck one horse. Now, Steve Asmussen obviously does have an embarrassment of riches in the sprint division, as he usually does. He also has Jackie's Warrior. So I don't know what the plans are with this one, but he's a good 3-year-old, no doubt about it.
Yeah, he's a really nice horse that for a brief time looked like maybe he wasn't going to go on following that hopeful score. Last year, he had a couple disappointing performances following that, but he's really taken a step forward in the second half of this 3-year-old season, obviously with those 2 big performances up in Saratoga, the Amsterdam and the Jerkins, but I think he proved in this race, Craig, that he's not just some horse that needs that Saratoga main track, because his PPs were kind of looking that way. All of his best speed figures had been earned at Saratoga, but not the case here, because he validated that form last time in the Jerkins to beat Conacher pretty soundly, turning the tables on a horse who had beaten him by 5 lengths in an optional claiming race from earlier in the season at Churchill Downs. So just seems like one that's doing very well right now. And I think, Craig, we'd be remiss not to mention Gunrunner. We've now talked about, I think, 6 stakes races, and 4 of the winners have been by Gunrunner. Taba, Society, Echo Zulu, and Gunite. They're all sons and daughters of Gunrunner, and it was just an amazing weekend for that sire.
Yeah, he's quickly approaching territory where he might surpass Broad Brush as my favorite horse ever. I've loved that horse for a long time, and I always will, but Gunrunner is definitely my favorite horse on the track in a very long time. Probably going back to Lost Code, who was another favorite of mine. And he's backing it up in the shed. I mean, it's just phenomenal what he's doing. It seems like every other stakes race, including a bunch of Grade 1s, are being won by his progeny.
And I think it should be noted that all of these horses that we've talked about achieved career best speed figures in the races that we just discussed. So he's having progeny that aren't just precocious, because he had a great season with his first crop as 2-year-olds, but they're continuing to improve. And I think it's scary to think if these horses continue to get better along the same trajectory that he did, achieving his best form as a 4-year-old, because he's already had so much success with his 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. It's just kind of amazing to see the continued success and actually increasing success from the progeny of Gunrunner. It was just an amazing weekend for him. I think he had a total of 5 stakes winners.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Gunrunner is certainly one who was good as a 2-year-old and as a 3-year-old, but at end of the 3-year-old season and especially the 4-year-old season, he just took it to another level, maybe even 2 above what he had been. So that's scary if his progeny foals are able to follow that.
Well, I'd say the most exciting race that they ran at Churchill Downs on Saturday was the Bourbon Trail, also for the 3-year-olds, this one going the 1 3/16 distance, as this was a real fight to the finish, and you had 3 horses hitting the wire basically all together, but it was the rail-skimming Home Brew who just got the job done in a little bit of a strange trip, Craig, because it looked like he was dropping out of the race at the top of the stretch, but he was able to come back on for the victory.
Yeah, this was one I kind of stuck with. I picked him in the West Virginia Derby, if you remember, and he didn't really do a lot of running that day. But when I just looked at the field in here, I didn't see a whole lot that I particularly liked, and I just figured he had another jump in him, and he certainly made it here. And the surprise for me was Creative Minister, because he was a horse I thought was just tailing off since his good Triple Crown run where he ran in 2 of the races and also ran on Kentucky Derby Day in a different race and looked like he was regressing, but he bounced right back. And hats off to Ken McPeak. He's a guy who is just not afraid to run his horses. I see this a lot with him where he just the horses seem to be tailing off and then boom, they come right back to form. And he was able to do it with Creative Minister. So I don't think I mentioned it was a 121 speed figure for Home Brew. He was a lot closer to the early pace, which was on the quick side. So only a 119 for Creative Minister, but good strong race from him.
Yeah, I agree with that. Ken McPeak has run his horses, his 3-year-olds, quite a lot this season. We're going to talk about another one later that has really danced many of the dances and is still performing well. But the same thing for Creative Ministry. He was able to bounce back with a good performance here. Homebrew, though, seems like one, like you were saying, a little disappointing last time over that sloppy track, but bouncing back here over some fast going at Churchill Downs on Saturday and a really game performance to get the job done. We also shouldn't go without mentioning War Campaign, who was third here. He went off at 9-1, forged the lead briefly in mid-stretch, but was run down at the very end by the resurgent Homebrew and the closing Creative Minister on the outside. But really exciting fight to the finish with all three of these runners.
Yeah, that Santa Anita or St. Louis Derby is proving to be a key race, I think.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the winner of that race a little bit later in this podcast. Craig, there were a few 2-year-old races last week at Churchill that caught the eye. I know there was an impressive, I think it was a filly that won on Sunday that was highly touted, but the 2-year-old performance that I thought was most impressive last week at Churchill actually took place pretty early in the week on Wednesday, and that was from the Ron Moquette-trained Protege. I thought this son of good magic ran pretty well in his debut.
Oh, he definitely did. He got a 101 speed figure, and I'll be honest, I didn't make the speed figures for this day. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to racing that day, and I got like 5 messages in my inbox on Twitter asking what figure Protege got like 27 minutes after the race was run. And I'm like, hold on, guys. Can we at least wait till it's over, till the card's over. But he looked good, and Ron Moquette's not a guy who really wins a lot first out. I never really know what to make of that when I see these. Is it the horse, or is it, maybe he changed MO because he knew he had a good precocious horse? But in this case, I tend to think that the horse probably surprised him and has some talent for sure, and I would expect better going forward.
Yeah, this horse was dismissed at 10-1 by the bettors, but traveled like he was ready to win. I mean, he showed good speed coming out of the starting gate, stalked those 2 early leaders, one of which was the eventual second-place finisher, Luca Knight, who ran pretty well to be second, 6 clanks clear of the rest of the field, but Protege was able to easily run by him at the top of the stretch and finished up like he might have something left in the tank. This one is by that first crop sire, Good Magic, who we've seen some nice things from, especially recently. He's the sire of Curly Jack, who just won the Iroquois at Churchill Downs. And on the dam side, there's some really nice pedigree for this horse, Craig, especially in the second generation. The dam is a half-sister to Creative Cause, Destin, who of course was second in the Belmont Stakes, and Vexatious, that Grade 1 personal ensign winner. So some real pedigree to stretch out if you look at the second generation of that dam side.
And I'm glad you mentioned Luca Knight, because I thought he ran a good race as well. He's no match for Protege, obviously, but he looks like he could be a pretty big sprinter. It was a big gap back to third place, like 6 lengths or so, I think you mentioned. So he's one I'd be watching going forward at sprint distances.
Let's move on to another venue, Aqueduct or Belmont at the Big A. Their Saturday card, the feature was the Grade 3 Athenia, run pretty early in the day, this one going 1.125 on the turf for the fillies and mares. Craig, we had handicapped this one last week, and I think both of us were a little bit skeptical of Love and Thunder getting the distance or just frankly being good enough to beat this field, but the public seemed pretty sure that she was the right one of the 2 Chad Brown runners to take, and she rewarded their faith, getting up to win here by a neck with a late rush.
Yeah, she did. I was watching this race while I was, I don't remember what I was doing, but I know I just kind of had it on in the background. And I thought your horse was home free, the 2-horse Evie Jets. Looked like she had it wrapped up, but Love and Thunder, that was quite a run. If you look at her pace figure, she really flew home. I didn't check trackets for the final quarter mile or final 3 furlongs in this case, whatever it was. But there's no doubt she was motoring, and she made the fans look smart on this one because she was clearly best. The pace was just moderate at best, unchallenged, so no excuses really for anybody else.
Yeah, this one was pretty agonizing for me to watch. I thought 9-2 was a great price on Evie Jets. Eric Hansel gave her the ride that I was hoping he would give her, did everything right, and she ran her race, just got run down by a horse who was simply better than her on the day. I mean, you can't really be too upset when you pick a horse that is just simply second best, and Love and Thunder produced that late kick to run her down. You mentioned Trackus, Craig. I did look it up. She went her final quarter, according to Trackus, in 21.93 23 seconds. So kind of makes sense that she was able to get up and you're able to run a final split that's quite that fast.
That's why I brought it up. I figured it had to be something like that, bordering on a sub 22. So well done by her.
The Sunday feature at Aqueduct was the Grade 2 Gallant Bloom, again for the fillies and mares, but this one, a 6.5 furlong dirt sprint. And, something that we haven't seen too many of the filly and mare sprinters do in this division this year, Craig, is put together back-to-back victories, and Kamari was able to do it here. She backed up her win in the Honorable Miss last time with a nice speed figure, with a good performance here in another Grade 2 event, the Gallant Bloom, running down Lady Rocket. And I've got to say, watching this race, I was thinking Lady Rocket had everything her own way on the front end. Nobody challenged her, but boy, Joel Rosario just rode Kamari with so much confidence. A hand ride past her to win.
Yeah, this was one of those races. She got a 114 speed figure for the win. It means absolutely nothing, in my opinion. The pace was ridiculously slow. I think they went 23:55 for the quarter, almost a 47 half. So basically it became a 2-horse sprint to the wire, as nobody else really did any running whatsoever in here. And Kamari got it done pretty easily. She was able to handle Lady Rocket, drew off by a length and a quarter. So I thought it was a very good performance. She does seem like a real threat for the filly and mare sprint if she likes the 7 furlongs. I think that's been a bit of a question in her career, which is a little puzzling given her running style, but we've seen that with other horses before. But I would judge her on that 122 last time, and that's actually proven to be a pretty strong race, the one where she nipped Frank's Rocket in the Honorable Miss.
Yeah, and I think Wesley Ward probably got in the perfect prep that he was looking for the Breeders' Cup. It was not the toughest race here. Really, Lady Rocket was her only rival, and she easily handled that foe. I saw some people commenting on Twitter about, the difference between the figure you gave this race and the Beyer folks. I think gave it a 106 Beyer, which I guess I understand if you're just viewing this race in isolation and you're just going to say Kamari ran as well as she did last time in the Honorable Miss, because like you were saying, it's tough to compare this race to the others on the day because the pace was so slow. But like you were saying, even giving it the lower number, you probably want to judge her off the speed figure that she got when she had to run all out in her prior start, the Honorable Miss.
Yeah, for me, I can't give a race that big of a bump up because of pace. I mean, they ran 23:55 quarter in a 6.5 furlong race. They're not going to run a fast final time. It's basically impossible after that.
And I saw some chatter from Wesley Ward that they were considering running Kamari in the Breeders' Cup Sprint next, as opposed to the filly and mare sprint, just looking for the 6 furlong distance instead. We'll see. It seems like this sprint is coming up a lot tougher than the filly and mare sprint this year, so maybe they'll look at the fields and reassess. But Wesley likes to keep you guessing with which race he's going to run in.
Yeah, he does that goofy stuff sometimes. It would make no sense to run this horse in the sprint when the filly and mare sprint. I mean, she just handled 6.5 fine, was closing like a freight train. I don't see, even though she hasn't had the greatest success at 7 before, I don't see how anybody could watch that race and think 7 will be an issue.
Let's move on to Pimlico, where they ran a number of stakes on their Saturday card. We're going to talk about a few of them. The Polynesian for the 3 and up runners going 2 turns. That was won by the 3-year-old Benevengo, who some people might remember as the pace setter in the Haskell, who fated to finish behind Taba and CyberKnife that day, but got a much better scenario here, Craig, as his main pace rival, Seafoam, just completely blew the start, and that left Benevengo as the lone leader.
Yeah, I think the race kind of ended right when that happened. It was a good effort from him. He was a horse who, he surprised, I thought, in the Haskell, setting a pretty solid pace, obviously against much better foes, but once he was left alone here, it was all over because there were no CyberKnifes or Tabas in this race to run him down. And he drew off with a career best TimeformUS speed figure of 120 and seems to be a horse moving in the right direction. He's still pretty lightly raced. Before that Haskell, he had made a big jump in his speed figure all the way to a 108. He ran a 115 in the Haskell, partly from setting that fast pace, and took another move forward here. So it seems like he's a pretty good one.
Yeah, this race did get the biggest speed figure out of Pimlico last week. I wouldn't say that I was most impressed by this performance, though. There were some others that we're going to talk about that I was a little bit more taken with. I just thought this horse kind of got handed the right scenario. We'll see if he's able to repeat it next time out, but it was a big step forward for that 3-year-old. The Laurel Dash, which this year was run at Pimlico on Saturday, was also run on this card. This one taken by Karatari, who's just been thereabouts in the sprint division on turf for a long time, not always winning the biggest races, but, usually in the conversation. And I thought he got the right trip here. Craig was dueling to the wire with Comedy Town, a horse that has lost a few photos recently, so maybe not one that's so eager to go buy another horse.
Yeah, that could be it. Karatari is solid. He just always kind of seems to show up. His last two hadn't looked very great at Monmouth. He didn't run very well in the Troy. I don't know what happened to him that day. He just didn't seem to show up. But he ran fine here. He got a 118 speed figure, which is always what he runs, right? Give or take a point or two when he's in good form. And it seems like he found good form. And I would imagine he'll be pointed to the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, which outside of Golden Pal, who was anything but impressive winning last time, it just seems about as wide open as a race could get. And if you think Golden Pal isn't going to show up with his A race, that is. I mean, if you think he is, then it's not wide open. But that last race was a little dubious, so why not for Karatari?
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that Wesley Ward is going to win that race with somebody. I mean, he's also got Campanelli, who did come off a victory, albeit be it a workman-like one at Kentucky Downs in her last start. So we'll see how strong that race does come up. But Karatari, he's got it in him to run a big speed figure on occasion, and he ran one of his good recent performances here. I'm not sure that he's back to his heyday based on this performance. But I will say this, for an ungraded race, Craig, this one felt like a tougher turf sprint than the grade 3 turf monster that they ran at Parx on Saturday. We didn't talk about that race. It just didn't come up that fast. It didn't look that strong coming in. So I'd much rather have horses coming out of this Laurel Dash than that race at Parx.
No doubt. It'll be interesting to see if any horses even get invited from that Parx race. I mean, we didn't talk about it for a reason. The winner wasn't particularly strong. 3-year-old didn't run fast, so it's going to be quite the challenge for whoever has to select the horses that are invited to this field.
Among these races at Pimlico on Saturday, I thought the most impressive performance was turned in by the 3-year-old filly Smash Ticket in the Weather Vane. She took a lot of money here, coming in with the fastest recent speed figure from Saratoga and also her prior start at Lone Star, but getting a little bit of a class test because there were some good fillies in this race, and she basically just ran them off their feet, Craig, got to the front end and really opened up on this field through the stretch. This was a nice performance from her.
It was, no doubt. I remember you were kind of touting this horse at Saratoga. I think she got scratched the one day we talked about her, but she looked pretty good once again. She ran a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a career best, and she's a quick one, no doubt about it. She didn't quite get the same speed figure at Saratoga that she did at Lone Star. I forget what the story was on that one, but this was no contest whatsoever. She was quick out of the gate, faced a little pressure, but then just shook it off and blew them away.
Yeah, she had missed the prioress at Saratoga with a bit of an issue. I forget exactly what it was, but clearly didn't need that much time off because she came back with this victory just about a month later. And yeah, she was impressive this day, ran back to that seasonal debut at Lone Star and then some. She is the younger half-sister to Slammed for the same ownership, who we've talked about a little bit, one that's racing in Southern California after having begun her career in the Southwest with Todd Fincher. Just a really great sprint producer for that damn Hennessy Smash. She's now got two really nice horses, one a 3-year-old and one a 4-year-old. Slammed just coming off a narrow loss in the Rancho Bernardo out in California recently. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with Smash Ticket next, because based on a performance like this, she's another one that they might want to take a look at the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint, because there were no standouts in that race. It seems like one that could be wide open this year. Before we move away from Pimlico, there's one more race that we should mention from a little bit earlier in the week on Friday, an allowance event won by the 3-year-old Mo Money, Mo Honey. And Craig, I don't think we know how good this horse is, because he's 3 for 3 in his career and he's basically unchallenged.
Yeah, he's won his 3 races by over 17 lengths. And I'll be honest, when you sent the rundown to me last night, I had to look up who it was, and I've made the speed figures for this horse. So for those that wonder if I know who the horses are, I usually don't, unless it's a stakes race that I'm obviously familiar with. But this horse ran a 114. He's took a step forward every single time, from a 101 to a 106 up to a 114. It seems like they've known he was good ever since he stepped foot on the racetrack. He went off at even money first time out, and has been a short price every time. But who knows what you got with him? He's quick. I like that he's able to break from the inside and still win easily. So he's one that definitely has a future. I'm not sure how good he is, and I don't think anybody knows how good he is just yet.
Yeah, he got a 118 final time number for this race, knocked out a little bit because the pace was on the slow to moderate side, but he really finished up strongly. I mean, he's only sprinted so far. I think the jury's still out with how far he wants to go. If they do decide to stretch him out in distance, he is a son of Uncle Mo, and when you watch him run, you really see that influence. He looks a lot like his sire, but he won this race very easily, Craig, seemingly. I mean, he was just not really asked too much in the final eighth of a mile to draw away to win by over 4 lengths. It's funny, I was looking up his pedigree. He's out of a dam, Stop Shopping Debbie, who actually began her career 9 for 9 racing up at Emerald Downs. They took one shot with her out in California in her 10th start, and she finished off the board in a graded stakes race, and they retired her after that. So Mo Money Mo Honey has a little ways to go to begin his career 9 for 9, but just kind of interesting that it's been a real winning pedigree here. Let's move on to one more venue before we wrap things up on this show, and one that I'm sure Craig studied quite a bit. That was the Remington Park card on Sunday night, featuring, of course, their premier race, the Grade 3 Oklahoma Derby. And Craig, this is the Ken McPeek horse that we were alluding to a little bit earlier in the show. This horse just seems to run every month, and he keeps showing up. Rattle and Roll.
Yeah, he's been impressive, and somehow he still keeps getting better. His last 2 races have been the best races of his career. He got a 120 speed figure this time after, I think it was a 116 when he won the St. Louis Derby easily. And he just looks like a horse who is one of those, if he's spotted properly, he just kind of always shows up, runs his race. Other than the Indiana Derby, where he really didn't run good on a track that had some moisture in it. The same thing had kind of happened in the Bluegrass. So maybe he just doesn't like it wet, but otherwise he's the kind that's going to run, show up, and he seems like he can pick off these grade 3 and high price listed races.
Yeah, and you could see he really wanted this victory here because he made that big sweeping move around the far turn to take over. Looked like he was going to win for fun, and the runner-up King Ottoman ranged up alongside him like he was going to go by in mid-stretch, and you could see Rattle and Roll dug back in and was able to hold that foe off. And like you said, he just keeps taking steps forward from a speed figure standpoint. He had a big excuse, if you remember, in that Indiana Derby, Craig. He was badly shut off, clipped heels at the start of that race, was left maybe 6 lengths behind the field right from the beginning. So, I mean, aside from that, performance that you can just draw a line through, he's run 3 good races in a row, run 3 derbies in a row, the American, the St. Louis, and the Oklahoma Derby, and they just keep picking up checks. He's won nearly $1 million at this point, and that's what you gotta love about Ken McPeek. He is not afraid to run these horses.
No, and King Ottoman ran fine too. Like you said, I was on the apron for this race, and I actually thought Rattle and Roll was going to get run down because he had made, as you said, that big, wide, sustained move. I think he was probably 4 wide all the way around the turn, kind of took the lead at the top of the stretch. And King Ottoman, who had won the Texas Derby, disappointed a little since, but had shown he had some talent that day, ranged up right next to him, and Rattle and Roll just dug in and pulled back away again. So he's a game win, and who knows where he's going to show up. I wouldn't recommend him for grade 1 races anytime soon, but he's certainly moving in the right direction, and he's a horse I would absolutely love to own.
Yeah, the disappointment in this race was the 3rd place finisher, Best Actor. Kind of interesting. He was coming off that big speed figure in his prior start in the Smarty Jones at Parx. They decided to go to the Oklahoma Derby instead of running in the Pennsylvania Derby, which was the natural prep race of the Smarty Jones being the prep for the Pennsylvania Derby. But both he and Greenup had run those big speed figures on that Smarty Jones day, and neither one came back to repeat them. So you just kind of wonder if maybe that's a race a couple of races you have to view with a little bit of skepticism, but he regressed to his prior form in this Oklahoma Derby.
He did, and as you'll remember, as we talked about on the forecast, those are both races that have the B for broken out because they were really tough speed figures to make, and they were kind of gapped out races like we saw on Saturday at Parx as well. So there have been some other horses come back and run, like we talked about Creative Minister. He came out of that Smarty Jones and ran fine, but they're definitely ones I'm going to need to keep an eye on.
The other race on the dirt at Remington on Sunday that achieved the noteworthy speed figure was the David M. Vance winner, Flash of Mischief. This horse actually the runner-up in the Oklahoma Derby last year, and also the winner of the 2021 St. Louis Derby, just like Rattle and Roll. And the two winners of those races in consecutive years came back and won consecutive races at Remington Park on Sunday night. Flash of Mischief, though, Craig, he seemed surprisingly sharp on the turn back to 6 furlongs.
He did. Now, he did get a pretty nice setup. They went 4 wide, I want to say it is, into the turn. They were, wide down the backstretch. And it just had the look of a race that was setting up for closers. We don't have it coded in red, but the fractions were pretty quick for these horses. The leader had a 126 pace figure to the quarter mile. But the way he drew off from the field, it makes you wonder. He's been fine at 2 turns. I'm sure he's won... Carl Broberg, the trainer, a lot of money because he's got a lot of 1s and 2s if you look through his PPs. But maybe they found something here at 6 furlongs because this was his best speed figure by a pretty good amount.
Yeah, I mean, his one prior sprint effort this year was coming off a long layoff, and prior to that, he hadn't sprinted since he had run in the Amsterdam as a 3-year-old when he finished far behind Jackie's Warrior. So maybe he hasn't had a true shot to become a sprinter in recent races, and he just was ready to deliver that performance here. Because I gotta admit, Craig, even though he got a good setup, which I agree with, the pace seemed like it came apart a little bit. The way that he kicked away from this field in the final eighth of a mile was really impressive. He threw in a sub-12 final eighth here to draw away from Empire of Gold, who's not a bad horse at all, by over 6 lengths. This was by far the best performance that this horse has put forth this year. And, going back to his 3-year-old season, it's really built on the form that he suggested he might be capable of then.
Yeah, you mentioned the Amsterdam, so I was looking through the PPs while you were talking, and before that Amsterdam, he had actually won 4 sprint races in a row, all by open length, so maybe that's the way to go, because he sure looked good doing that. It's just that you don't see that kind of closing fraction even in top-class races most of the time.
Well, that's all the racing to recap this week. Definitely some Breeders' Cup preps have taken place. A lot to look forward to on the racing calendar as we march ahead to that championship day in a few weeks. And we're going to get a lot more of that, Craig, as we move on to this upcoming weekend. Some big stakes races on tap at Aqueduct, where they will be running the Grade 1 Woodward this week. On Saturday, likely to have a very small field there with Life is Good supposed to be in the field. Also some stakes races at Churchill Downs, the Lucas Classic in that same division, probably going to have a more competitive field. So we'll see how these cards come up and take a look at to see which one we want to talk about on the TimeformUS forecast this week.
Yeah, these weeks coming up are always some of my favorites, even as much as the Breeders' Cup, because you get so many good horses running. Now, I know these days we get a lot of the training up to, but sometimes that makes these races better, as a lot of the horses that are doing the training up to would be prohibitive favorites. So I think there'll be some good betting opportunities this weekend.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to have a lot of racing action coming at us, probably some longer pace casts as we try to recap these races in the coming couple of weeks or so, but you got to look forward to it, having all of these horses in action around the same time period. So a lot of handicapping that we can look forward to later in the week when we get there. But for now, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Pacecast. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.